Today, the final send-off, ironically, was for suspected female gangster Claire Adi Vybz, or as she is also infamously known as Nairobi's prettiest thug.
Identified as Mwaniki, alias Paul Mwaniki, finally caught up with him.
On an August morning in 2017, elite flying squad officers quietly surrounded a swamp in Waiteithi in Kiambu County. Hidden among the reeds was a 23-year-old gangster who had become one of the most wanted men in Kenya. For nearly 2 hours, gunfire echoed across the area as officers closed in from every direction. This wasn't just another police operation. It was the final chapter of a manhunt that had gripped Nairobi for months. The man trapped inside was heavily armed, extremely dangerous, and the cops weren't there to negotiate. At this point, he had ambushed and murdered police officers, stealing their service weapons to build his gang's arsenal. By the time the shooting stopped, Paul Mwaniki, better known as Mwanii Sparta, was dead. But the real story isn't how he died, but how a 23-year-old from Nairobi's Eastlands built a gang that became bold enough to wage war against the police themselves. Welcome. This is Dark Hour Docs. To understand how one of Nairobi's most wanted gangsters emerged, we have to go back to August 2014. The death of Tommaso Gagula left the notorious Gaza Gang without a leader, creating a dangerous power vacuum in Nairobi's Eastlands. Among those ready to seize the opportunity was a young man named Paul Mwaniki, better known on the streets as Mwanii Sparta. Inspired by Jamaican dancehall icon Vybz Kartel, Mwanii quickly assumed leadership of the gang. But he understood that wearing the crown meant little without loyal men and women willing to fight, kill, and, if necessary, die for him. Before expanding the gang, he first set out to build a trusted inner circle that would help him consolidate his authority. The first person he brought to his side was his childhood friend Teddy Kasanga, a feared street bully who would become his second in command. Together, they selected 3 more trusted members to form what they regarded as the Gaza Gang's cabinet. Joining that inner circle came with its own rituals. According to accounts of the gang's practices, new members had their heads shaved with razor blades as a sign of initiation before taking oaths of loyalty. They were then encouraged to smoke cannabis, a ritual believed to strip away fear and strengthen their commitment to the gang. While Mwanii oversaw the ceremonies and charted the gang's direction, Teddy earned a reputation as its chief enforcer, carrying out violence against anyone who threatened their growing influence. Yet one important member of Mwanii's future leadership was still missing. His close friend, Kolo, was serving time at Industrial Area Prison. Rather than replace him, Mwanii reserved a place for him in the gang, convinced that once he regained his freedom, he would become one of Gaza's most trusted generals. As he waited for Kolo's release, another person entered his life who would eventually become one of the most recognizable faces of the gang. Her name was Claire Adi Vybz, although few people knew her by that name. Inspired by the gang's admiration for Vybz Kartel, she adopted the street name Claire Adi Vybz. The relationship between the two developed quickly, and before long, they welcomed a baby boy together. Fatherhood changed Mwanii's outlook. Providing for his young family became another reason to expand his criminal activities, convincing himself that bigger risks would bring bigger rewards. Within the gang, Claire was far more than the leader's partner. She became known as the Queen of Gaza, working alongside another female member, Marsha Minaj. Together, they lured unsuspecting victims from clubs and entertainment spots before other gang members moved in to rob them. As the months passed, Claire quietly became one of the most trusted members of Mwanii's inner circle. In 2016, Kolo was finally released on bond and immediately reunited with Mwanii. With his trusted lieutenant back at his side, the Gaza Gang resumed a string of robberies targeting M-Pesa shops and businesses across Nairobi's Eastlands. The attacks brought in money, strengthened the gang's reputation, and emboldened his young leader. Then, one robbery changed everything. A successful raid on an M-Pesa shop in Kayole would lead to Mwanii acquiring his first firearm. Now, with a gun in his hands, Mwanii began thinking beyond street robberies, convincing himself and his gang that they could dominate Nairobi's underworld. To do this, they needed more firepower, and this belief would soon place him on a collision course with the Kenyan police. Armed with his first firearm, Mwanii no longer saw himself as an ordinary street robber. So, with its newfound confidence, the gang graduated from targeting M-Pesa shops to carrying out armed home invasions. One of the most shocking attacks came in the early hours of February 2015, when he and his accomplices stormed the home of former Moyale Member of Parliament, Philip Godana. The gang stole household items before fatally shooting the former legislator in front of members of his family.
Now, we're told that Godana was shot dead this morning at his home in Syokimau in the outskirts of Nairobi. And according to police reports, 4 gunmen raided his home at 2 a.m. and shot him while he was asleep. Police say that the attackers fired at the MP when they met resistance as they tried to rob the family. Philip Godana.
The murder was ruled out for a contract killing because when a neighbor heard the commotion, he fired a warning shot that led the robbers to panic, killing Philip. This robbery marked a turning point. Violence was no longer a means of escape. It had become part of the gang's strategy. More importantly, Mwanii had become convinced that firearms gave his crew an overwhelming advantage over both civilians and the police. And for Gaza to dominate Nairobi's underworld, they needed more guns. But buying weapons for an entire gang was expensive, and Mwanii would settle for a far more dangerous alternative. His plan was simple: attack and steal firearms from the very people entrusted with enforcing the law. His first known target was administration police officer Estin Muthini. On 30th November 2016, the officer was ambushed in Mihango area while walking home. He was shot several times in the chest, but the attack failed to achieve its objective. Estin had not been carrying his service weapon, and this left the gang empty-handed. For the first time, Mwanii had targeted a police officer, and he feared the attack had exposed his identity. So the gang quickly disappeared into hiding, expecting detectives to close in. But this did not happen, and the murder remained unsolved because investigators had not yet identified those responsible. To Mwanii, the silence sent a dangerous message, as he believed he had gotten away with it. If one attack on a police officer had produced no immediate consequences, then there was little reason not to try again. Soon, another opportunity presented itself. On Friday night, on January 13, 2017, after dropping Principal Secretary Margaret Muariyama at her Nairobi residence, Sergeant Asbel drove his official Prado back to his home in Umoja Estate. He had barely begun unloading groceries for his family when gunmen riding a motorcycle struck. That night, Mwanii and his accomplices shot the officer 2 times in the head before seizing his service firearm. Moments later, they used the stolen weapon to fire additional shots at the fallen officer before fleeing into the night with the pistol. For Mwanii, the operation proved that his plan worked, that they could acquire police firearms without purchasing a single bullet. They were now better armed, more confident, and increasingly difficult to stop. But this victory came with a price, because as the gang celebrated the attack, Mwanii made a fatal mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through careless conversation with a woman, Gaza was now on the radar of detectives. and for the first time, the walls around Mwanii Sparta began to close in. Despite the murder of Sergeant Asbel Kiplimo handing Mwanii a police firearm, the operation had resulted in unexpected consequences. Mwanii boasted about the killing to a woman he trusted, and she quietly passed the information to a police informer. The leaked information changed everything. He didn't know who had talked, but he became convinced it was someone within the gang. Convinced that someone inside Gaza had betrayed him, Mwanii stopped looking over his shoulder at the police and started looking at the men standing beside him. Trust quickly gave way to suspicion, and suspicion gave way to murder. The first person to pay the price was his longtime friend Kolo. Fresh out of industrial area prison, he had resumed his position as one of Gaza's senior members. But Mwanii had become increasingly convinced that Kolo was having an affair with his wife, Claire Adi Vybz, which was all fueled by online interactions and photos. The two had been interacting online, and to Mwanii, that alone was enough to warrant confrontation. He called him and asked him to meet at a quarry in Kayole, where he arrived expecting to meet a friend. Instead, he found a man consumed by suspicion. Mwanii confronted him over the alleged relationship with Claire, which he denied, but his pleas changed nothing. He was shot dead, and his body dumped into the flooded quarry below. Confident that no one would investigate the disappearance of a gangster, Mwanii simply walked away. But that was not the end. The second person to go in his crew was Aliko, who was suspected to be an informer since it was his girl that Mwanii had bragged to about killing Asbel Kiplimo. With Kolo and Aliko gone, his attention returned to the police. The gang had already proven they could steal firearms from officers, and Mwanii wanted more. At around 11 p.m. on March 20th, 2017, Police Constable Japheth Muithi and his friend Catherine were about to enter a parked car outside Naivas supermarket in Kayole when gunmen struck. Japheth was shot dead at the scene, and they stole his service firearm, loaded with 15 rounds of ammunition. The 29-year-old woman who was with him was also shot 3 times, but she survived.
2 police officers have been shot dead by suspected criminals in Kayole here in Nairobi.
Well, police say one of the officers was shot on the head and the other on the chest, and the criminals stole the officers' firearms.
Unlike the earlier attacks, these recent ones immediately alarmed senior police commanders, and detectives no longer believed the killings were isolated incidents. They were now looking for a gang that was systematically targeting police officers for their weapons. Nairobi County Police Commander Japheth declared war on Mwanii and the Gaza Gang, intensifying the manhunt. Forced into hiding, the gang moved cautiously between safe houses, but the pressure continued to build. In April 2017, detectives received intelligence about one of their hideouts and moved in to arrest them. A fierce gun battle followed, and during the exchange, police officer Boniface Okech was fatally shot and his firearm stolen. Although the gang escaped, officers recovered several stolen weapons, ammunition, and handcuffs from the hideout, confirming that the firearms had belonged to slain police officers. With his escape, cops put a post on Facebook warning that one of his pals had been shot dead and his days were numbered. But losing those weapons only made Mwanii more determined, and not long afterwards, another officer became a target. A police officer, Kennedy, who was attached to State House official John Makumi, was ambushed and killed. His Seska pistol and 12 rounds of ammunition were stolen, adding yet another police weapon to the gang's growing arsenal. By now, the gang was very confident, as they had become better armed, and every murdered officer seemed like a win to them. But with this one battles against cops, Mwanii was about to suffer the greatest loss of his life. And this time, there was nothing he could do about it. By May 2017, the police had intensified surveillance across Nairobi's Eastlands. Detectives were tracking the gang through informers, monitoring known associates, and responding aggressively to every armed robbery linked to the group. On May 12, the pressure finally reached Mwanii's inner circle. During an attempted robbery at an M-Pesa shop in the Lower Chokaa area in Embakasi, undercover detectives confronted members of the gang and a gunfight erupted. And when the shooting stopped, Claire Adi Vybz lay dead at only 18 years old. To the public, she had become known as Nairobi's prettiest thug, but to police, she was far more than the girlfriend of the gang leader. She was tasked with transporting weapons, helped recruit members, and took part in robberies alongside the Gaza Gang. For Mwanii, her death was deeply personal. Forced into hiding, he could only mourn her from a distance, posting a brief tribute online. "R.I.P. my love, miss you so much." He never attended her funeral, as police heavily monitored the burial, hoping one of Nairobi's most wanted fugitives would appear to pay his final respects. He never did. And instead, detectives arrested several men at the funeral who they believed had links to the gang, with Mwanii remaining out of reach.
3 men were arrested at a burial in Murang'a County today. The final send-off, ironically, was for suspected female gangster Claire Adi Vybz, or as she is also infamously known as Nairobi's prettiest thug.
The somber affair was attended by friends and family who did not address the mourners.
With Claire gone, investigators shifted their attention to another woman they believed remained in close contact with the gang. This was Marsha Minaj. She had risen through the ranks to become one of Gaza's most trusted members and was believed to be armed. Just weeks later, an opportunity presented itself. On May 28, 2017, supporters of a NASA coalition gathered at Jacaranda grounds for a political rally. Detectives were already in the area anticipating that criminals might target the large crowds. They were right. When members of the public raised an alarm over a robbery, officers chased the suspects to a nearby bedsitter where Marsha Minaj was found alongside another gang member. They were ordered to surrender, but refused, with a shootout following that ended with both of them dead.
Other female suspect killed, and this is apparently, remember they said they called her the most beautiful gangster in Nairobi, Claire Adi, who was slain not too long ago. So her friend Marsha Minaj has now also been slain by police. And
within weeks, Mwanii had lost 2 of the people closest to him, and the gang was getting thinner and thinner. But instead of disappearing, they became even more violent. On August 18, 2017, gunmen from the Gaza Gang ambushed 2 police officers in Kiambu, killing them and escaping with an AK-47 rifle.
And 2 policemen from Githunguri in Kiambu County were shot dead by unknown gunmen while on patrol. The 2 officers attacked the Kibichoi police post were patrolling Mitikenda area on foot when they were ambushed by gunmen on motorbike.
Soon afterwards, photographs emerged showing members of the gang posing with the stolen weapon, and to detectives, the message was unmistakable. The Gaza Gang no longer feared the police, and there would be consequences for their actions. Surveillance was intensified as detectives increasingly relied on trusted informers while keeping details of their operation tightly restricted. They believed information about previous raids had been leaking to the gang from within the security services and were determined not to let it happen again. Eventually, the intelligence led them to an estate in Ruiru, where elite flying squad officers quietly moved into position. They surrounded the gang's hideouts before launching their operation. What followed was a hefty confrontation. For nearly 2 hours, gunfire echoed across the estate as heavily armed officers exchanged fire with the gang. Several suspects scattered into nearby compounds and the surrounding swamp, hoping to escape the tightening police cordon. One by one, they were brought down, and among the first to fall was a gang member known as Willie. He was fatally shot after shooting a civilian while attempting to force his way into a compound. And for his boss, Mwanii had managed to evade officers longer than anyone else. He fled into the swamp, moving through the reeds in a desperate attempt to reach safety, but there was nowhere left to run. After nearly an hour of searching, flying squad officers cornered him near a riverbank and opened fire. At just 23 years old, Michael Paul Mwaniki, aka Mwanii Sparta, was dead. His rise had lasted only a few years. He terrorized Nairobi and its neighbors all together, but his downfall took just a few months. In the end, the same ambition that had made him one of Nairobi's most feared gang leaders also placed him on a collision course with the Kenyan police, a battle he was never going to win. This has been Dark Hour Docs. Thank you for watching.